Hello there, and welcome to another episode of the Let's Get Mental podcast, the podcast in which we talk about mental health and how it affects young people. I'm your host, Tim, and I'm also joined by Bri,
Hello.
Archie,
Hello there.
and Jack.
Hi guys.
This week, we discuss anxiety disorders and their symptoms, but also how it can be overcome and the little things you can do to reduce your anxiety on a day-to-day basis. We're going to get stuck right in and discuss the symptoms of both anxiety on its own, and also perhaps other anxiety disorders. We're talking about symptoms both physically and mentally. So, firstly, I want to come to Bri. First off, welcome back to the show. Talk us through what anxiety feels like. What are the basic symptoms someone might experience?
I think anxiety is pretty different for everyone because I know people can experience it differently. But for me, the main sort of thing that I experience is my chest. So I get this really heavy feeling in my chest, and have you ever been in school and you kind of like you're tipping back on your chair on the two legs,
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden you accidentally feel yourself go, and you're like, oh no, and then it feels like it's something in your chest just like drops. And it's that exact feeling that I get whenever I'm like feeling really anxious. And if that carries on for quite a long period of time, I get sort of other things that come alongside that. So I feel really exhausted. Sometimes if I'm like really caught up in my thoughts, I can get sort of quickening breath, and then obviously that can lead to panic attacks and things. But I think it's also important to remember that not everyone who suffers from anxiety, and especially anxiety disorders, always has panic attacks, but that they are quite closely linked.
No, that's very true. Yeah, you can have anxiety, but and panic attacks, or some people might not have panic attacks at all, and will just generally feel anxious. Now, coming to Jack. Of course, welcome back to the show. So, anxiety and its symptoms. Is it unique for you as well?
Oh, definitely. I think that for me, anxiety has been quite a prominent presence in my life because it's my most major diagnosis that I have, anxiety disorder, social anxiety. At least I was diagnosed with, and for me, I actually do experience panic attacks, and that's actually, I'd say, the main kind of form in which my anxiety manifests, because usually I might be feeling anxious, and I think that's misinterpreted by a lot of people. Like, a lot of people think that anxiety is just stress and just feeling anxious in that way, but actually there's a lot more to it, and it's a lot more physically linked than you might believe from an outsider's perspective. Like, for me, like when I'm kind of like on the verge of a panic attack and when my anxiety is playing up, I tend to experience, like, as Bryce said before, like a tight chest, and it's like I can barely breathe, which leads to kind of like my heart beating faster, and sometimes sweating, and feeling sick and dizzy for me. So it can be different for different people, and yeah, I think it's this surge of adrenaline which is the most terrifying for me, because not only does it affect me physically, but it kind of like affects me, my mentality as well. It kind of like puts me into this cycle of rumination and fear, and it makes me like be anxious about my anxiety. And I think, oh, like, what if I faint? Like, what if I'm sick? Like, I don't want to make a fool of myself. And that's kind of like the mindset in general for me when it comes to my social anxiety. So it's definitely overlooked, I think, in many cases.
It sounds like that fear of fear is quite terrifying. Like, worrying about anxiety itself can sometimes be worse than the anxiety. Would that be right?
Oh, definitely, yeah. I think that when you're in that kind of mindset, it definitely doesn't help things, and it makes it a lot worse. Like, I might be on the verge of a panic attack before, but it makes it a lot worse when kind of like I don't have someone to kind of like be there and guide me through it and change the cycle, like break the cycle, or I don't have anything to do to break the cycle. Because I think, as we'll probably cover later, the only way out of that really for me is to either distract myself or like for someone to kind of like help me through it and change my mindset.
Very detailed description there. Thank you very much, Jack. Archie.
Um, Anxiety. I mean, I guess if we're looking like the stigma and assumptions around it. I mean, what does it feel like mentally and physically? I guess it's one of those things where I don't know whether I've experienced anxiety or not, because it's one of those things that I've never been tested or diagnosed for. So, and I think I've seen people with I've seen people with anxiety. Like, I think when I did the medical health practitioner, I think it was interviews, there was someone who came in with anxiety, and I think that person definitely had it, because I could see, and I think, of course, they did tell us before that I think someone who was coming in who had anxiety, and the sort of symptoms that they had was sort of almost shivering, found it very hard to basically speak, and not like, I mean, when they were able to speak finally, obviously everything that they said was completely perfect, and it made perfect sense, but I think it was sort of like almost being nervous and obviously worried about how others might judge you and see you. But I can obviously see how much that was mentally affecting them, because obviously, I mean, like Jack was saying, while they're obviously dealing with that anxiety, in the back of their mind, they're probably thinking at the same time, God, my anxiety is really messing up what I'm doing right now. And then physically as well, like, I mean, their body is shaking, they're probably, the eyes moving, worried and stuff like that. And I think it can be quite patronizing to an extent, because I feel like if people around you feel like they've got to, because I think people look around you and sort of look at you when you're having an anxiety attack, and they sort of not, in a sense, they kind of feel sorry for you in that sense, and I think they try and sort of tell you, it's all right, calm, just take your time, stuff like that. But I think in a sense that might even set it off more, because they might think to themselves, well, I'm creating a scene here, I'm creating a bit of a problem here, everyone's stopping what's happening right now for me. And it's obviously it's a very delicate thing to deal with, but I mean, in terms of the stigma around it, is obviously something we're going to be talking about. Is like, I feel, I mean, I think it comes back to the point of where it's like, how do you diagnose anxiety? Obviously, the differences between someone who has anxiety, and then obviously what we were saying before about someone who just is a bit stressed or a bit nervous. And I think it's quite a hard thing to decipher.
Some very valid points there. Coming on to stigma then, what are the most irritating stigmas, and also what can we do to break those stigmas? Bride, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, so I have been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, which has manifested in many different ways throughout my life. But I'd say the worst sort of, not assumption, and I know people do it from a place of wanting to help, but when you open up to somebody about an anxiety disorder and they try to relate it to them, when sometimes it's not the same. Like, I understand everybody gets anxious, but the point of an anxiety disorder is that it's to a level where it shouldn't be. And like, the feeling of anxiety is something that we feel from an evolutionary standpoint for a reason, and everyone goes through that, and I totally get it. But I think, and I'm not downplaying other people's experiences of feeling anxious, because in certain situations, like going for a job interview or whatever, that feeling of anxiety can be really huge, and I definitely understand that. But I think having an anxiety disorder is more than being in uncomfortable situations and feeling nervous about them. It's, lying in bed at night and everything coming flooding back to you, and it's that kind of mental process that's linked to the physical process as well. So like, a lot of the anxieties I have are surrounding social situations. Even if I'm not in those social situations, it will be thinking back to the social situations. It will be, I have a bit of health anxiety that I struggle to deal with, and it's the mental processes around that and how that can make you feel, to the point where it shouldn't be causing you this much impact on your life. So I know people try to kind of relate to you to make you feel a bit more comfortable and like they can open up to you and stuff, but sometimes it's not the same. You want people to just sit and listen about what you have to go through on a daily basis, because anxiety just it doesn't go away because you're having a good day or whatever. It's just how you manage to cope with it, kind of thing.
Some very interesting insights there, Brian. Interesting also how you separate just feeling anxious, which everyone will feel because it's part of being human, and also having an anxiety disorder. There's a very, very big difference, and also something you touch on, which I really like. As someone who suffered from anxiety myself, it's if someone wants to support someone with anxiety, sometimes listening to what they have to say is the best form of support, and not assuming how anxiety works. Those are some really useful insights. Jack, are there any stigmas surrounding anxiety which have affected you? And also, what would you like to see change around with regards to views on anxiety disorders?
Well, I can think of a couple of kind of like big stigma topics. Like one definitely relates to what Bri was saying about people kind of like taking it, misunderstanding it. Like with the first one, I can think of people will kind of like blindly reassure you that it's going to be okay, and they'll presume. I think more importantly, they'll presume they'll know what to do, and I think it's important to know that for different people, anxiety can manifest differently, and different people have different boundaries. So, for me, what might work, even from some people, might not work from some other people. Like, if I'm going through a panic attack, it will help me if I have a hug from, say, like one of my best friends. But I know that other people really don't like hugs, and even if they do like hugs, sometimes it can be like an invasion of privacy and space if they're going for an anxiety attack. And depending on the person, I can actually feel the same. Like for some people, if I'm not that close to that person, I genuinely don't want that kind of reassurance from them. And I literally just want my own space. So I think it's important to actually get to know that person before you assume things like that, and like get them to tell you what they want and what they kind of like, what helps them best, in specifically with their anxiety, rather than kind of like assuming what you think is best for them based on your knowledge of anxiety. And the second main stigma I can think of is actually a personal experience of mine. When I was in high school, when my anxiety first peaked, I'd say, and it was horrendous what the attitude of some of the staff in the school and some of the parents and whatnot were saying. Like, they'd say to me, oh, it's just a bit of stress, you just need to bite the bullet and get through it. Like, you just need to bottle it up like a man and, just get on with things. Like, that's what they'd say to me. And that would make me feel guilty and ashamed, and I'd feel that I was weak and I was different to everyone else, purely because I wasn't able to bottle it up, as they said, and just move on and just dismiss it as a bit of stress. When obviously back then I didn't have the understanding that I have now, that anxiety isn't just a bit of stress, and anxiety disorder is a lot more serious. And as Bryce said, it is when you are anxious to an abnormally high level, and it is this evolutionary response that has evolved too much, really. And it's kind of like you gain all of these stress hormones out of nowhere, and you don't know how to kind of like manage with it or how to deal with it. So it's just this flood of stress in your mind, and you just panic, and it obviously manifests in physical symptoms. So yeah, I think that as the second part of your question that you mentioned, like how can we change this, I think it's important to kind of like just understand the stigma a bit more, and to fight it by understanding that anxiety can actually dominate your life, and that the cure to it isn't simply by exposing them to that, like their triggers, but to actually work with them and to help them kind of like deal with coping mechanisms, rather than actually sending them off into oblivion to kind of like deal with what makes them anxious. And even then, you might not know what makes them anxious, because sometimes I have panic attacks out of nowhere. Like sometimes there isn't a conscious trigger, and you can actually get anxious out of nowhere. So yeah, I think the main message from that, how things should change, stigma-wise, is people need to be more understanding. People need to understand that anxiety is very much based on the individual, and you need to understand the person to be able to even kind of like relate to what they're going through.
That was really, really powerful, Jack. And also, as I'm sure we can all agree, anxiety is different for everyone. No two anxiety sufferers are the same, and also bottling it up is never a good thing. Always, talk to people. Don't suffer inside your own head. But that was seriously, Jack. That was really powerful. That also brings us now on to personal experiences of anxiety, and I will also just touch on this myself briefly. I have suffered from general anxiety disorder. I've had panic attacks, although I have overcome panic disorder. I've been through hypochondria, health anxiety, which I defeated 5 years ago. Although at the minute I've got anxiety that's back in the form of obsessive compulsive disorder, and OCD will be a topic for a later episode, which I'll also be hosting, and can't wait to host that and share what OCD is like. But yes, Archie, have you had any personal and very specific experiences of anxiety?
I mean, I think over the last few days, I think there's two that I can really think of. There's one that's been very recently over the last few days, sort of like a bit of like, a bit of like a sort of a work thing where is the stuff that I'm doing actually any good? Is it worth of me doing this? Is it, because is my work that I'm doing any good? I was getting quite anxiety about the sort of the work that I was doing recently, and I was looking at what I was doing, and I wasn't sure if it was actually any good. It was just sort of like a thing where I was just sort of feeling, is what I'm contributing any good here? And I think the second, which is probably the more broader term, which I'm getting to, is a bit of I don't know if it is obviously intertwined with anxiety or if it's completely separate, but a bit of imposter syndrome is something that I get quite a lot of, where I feel like I'm not worthy of being here. There's no way that I'm basically on the same level as these type of people. I don't feel like I can contribute anything, and that's something that I get a lot of. Like, I mean, I think that came to me a lot of the time in school. Just built over the years, because there was a lot of times like when sitting in class and the teacher would ask a question and you'd put your hand up to ask a question, and I'd put my hand up, and just as everyone else did, on an easy answer, and then the teacher would pick someone else, okay, and then the answer that person would give would be completely wrong to what I would say. Completely different to what I would say. And I was like, oh my word, if I had actually been picked by the teacher, then I would have made myself look like a right idiot, and I think that's one of the reasons where it stems from. It goes a bit deeper than that in school as well, where when I got put into different like classes and sets, I was always put in the bottom set and stuff like that. I was willing to learn and stuff like that, but it can sort of make you feel like that I'm not, because it's weird when you're friends with people in the same year as you, but they're in higher classes than you, and you kind of wonder to yourself, why am I in lower sets? Am I not as smart as them? Am I not am I not equal to them in any sense? And I think that's sort of stuck with me as I've gotten older, that I found it very hard to sort of, I guess when it comes to obviously being yourself in a social way, I think I'm fine with that. But when it comes to work, when it comes to anything that requires you to obviously think, I think that's where I sort of worry that when I contribute something, am I going to be completely making something that has nothing to do with what anyone's talking about? So those are probably the main experiences of anxiety that I've had, and I think it definitely stems from education from school.
Do you think education is Do you think that's where, for a lot of people, it anxiety manifests itself from an early age in an educational setting?
Oh, without a doubt, because I mean, you get taught at school that the things that you must be good at learning. These are the subjects that you must do well in. Okay, that these are the ones you have to learn. And for me, like I was like, all right. I mean, I have to learn my English, my maths, and sciences. I completely get that, but I was never able to sort of show where I excelled in other areas. Like, of course, when it came physically, I think that's where I was able to excel against a lot of other people. But when it came to actual education and sort of, the more thinking and writing side of stuff, that's where I really struggled. And I feel that school could have been a lot better when it comes to that sort of thing. I think a lot of children and young people struggle with this because there's so many areas that I'm sure they're great at, but because the education system is so narrowed and bottleneck into this sort of, you have to learn these subjects, that you get compared to obviously the best people in your class that are learning those subjects. But hang on a second, if they chose a subject about something that I'm quite passionate about and I know a lot about, I'd make them look like the stupid one. But I never got that opportunity. I was always taught that these are the ones I have to learn, and if and obviously I was not very good at them. So that was where it really did stem from.
That's a really useful insight there, to see where anxiety can start, although it may not start in education for everyone. I think,
of course, yeah.
a lot of people can relate to you there, Archie. Bri, your personal experiences of anxiety, what has it affected you in multiple areas, or just one? Perhaps where did it stem from?
I think actually mine kind of stemmed from just being a kid. I think this is no shade to my parents. I love my parents a lot, but there was a lot of times when I was younger that I was on my own. Well, not on my own. There was always my brothers there, my two older brothers. And yeah, there was just a lot of time that it was us kids because my dad worked away quite a lot and my mom like worked evenings sometimes. And I think I just kind of developed this tendency to worry about everything. Like when my parents weren't there, I was worrying about what they were doing, and kind of, yeah, it just stemmed into being a massive worrier. And then throughout my teenage years, as you become like go through puberty and you become a lot more aware of other people and what other people think of you and things like that, it kind of manifested in terms of social anxiety was really, really heightened. And I couldn't do anything kind of socially by myself. I couldn't go into a shop and order things. I couldn't go to a restaurant and say what I wanted to eat. My parents would have to do it on my behalf because I just couldn't do it. Just, yeah, really struggled in that sense. And then since having some sort of therapy around that, I still have those underlying general sort of like anxieties, and they manifest in terms of sort of worrying about my own future, other people's futures. As I say, health is quite a big one that I worry about, especially at the moment. I think I like control in my life, and that's where mine stems from. So it's more of a personality thing. I mean, it's not a personality thing, but I'm one of those people that I want to be in control of everything and then want to know what's happening. And there is so much in life that you cannot predict, and that gives me intense anxiety. So then I try to think of every single scenario in my head and come up with a solution for it, which again is impossible. So I just kind of work myself into these little frenzies. But yeah, I wouldn't say it necessarily got worse or better in specific situations. I mean, obviously when I suffered with social anxiety, it was more difficult in certain sort of social instances. But I think linking back to schools, I'd say that in some ways school didn't make it worse as such, but I found a way to mask my anxiety because of obviously all the stigmas about it at school. And I just kind of put on this massive persona when I went to school, and became the kind of class clown, which didn't really make sense because I had social anxiety at the time. And I think for a lot of people who I told at the time, they were a bit like, well, how does that make sense? Because when you're at school, you're like this total different person, you're so outgoing. And that was just kind of the way I coped with it in an environment that I was relatively comfortable with. Like school was a relatively comfortable place for me at the time. So I know for most kids it's not, but so I don't know, I think it made it harder to kind of understand what was going on, because it provided this other aspect for people to go, well, you don't have anxiety because you play up in class and you do all this, like surely you can't worry about stuff like that. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. But so I wouldn't say it necessarily got worse in certain situations. I just handled it very differently in different situations, and it just means that it becomes a bit more complicated that way. But yeah,
I think the word complicated is a good word to describe anxiety. Really, it's a whole it's a whole sort of, well, perhaps mess of emotions or thoughts. Would you agree with that?
yeah, I definitely agree. And it's also complicated in the way that it's sort of so mentally and physically linked, because you, I describe a lot of my anxiety symptoms as mental, and then the symptoms of it I describe as physical, and then how they link with each other. And it's quite a complicated sort of disorder when you think about it, and something to live with. It's really difficult because you may not appear on the outside that you're struggling, but internally you will be. And then there's times where you appear on the outside that you're struggling, but it's not even the worst you've struggled at all. So yeah.
Very, very interesting. Very, as we've heard from everyone, they're very anxiety is almost very dynamic in a way, and can affect everyone in their own way. As I said earlier, no two anxiety sufferers are the same, but you don't have to suffer for forever. Anxiety, it might seem or feel very permanent, but it can be overcome. However, as I'm sure you're aware, overcoming anxiety is not an instant process. It can take time, months, maybe years, but there will come a day when you overcome anxiety, whatever anxiety disorder that is. And there are little things that you can do to cope with anxiety on a day-to-day basis. I'm going to come to Archie first about coping with anxiety on a day-to-day basis. What would be your top tips for coping with anxiety on a daily basis in order to overcome it in the long run?
I mean, this is going to sound quite a weird one, but I think my brother, I think, has been coping with his anxiety recently, and something that I mean, this is just something you can do. It's not. I'm not going to say it's going to work for everyone, but he actually got a pair of Chinese worry balls, which are basically little metal balls that you turn in your hand, and they're sort of like they're not like a stress ball or anything like that, but you just turn them in your hands, and it's sort of like a sort of stimulating sort of calmness to them that just relaxes your body and just tries to calm you down. That's something that I know he's been using to help with his anxiety quite a bit. But obviously there are people out there who have much more severe anxiety, and I'm talking to people who can't even go outside, or potentially can't go out anywhere, or or do anything. But because I think there's quite a big spectrum of anxiety. You have the people who obviously have it when they're in a bit of a social group, and then you have it to the extreme where people find it very hard, to even leave their house. But in terms of coping mechanisms, I guess, first of all, is obviously, make sure you've got, hopefully friends and family that are close to you, that obviously that you're close to. Obviously, that's one of the first things. You want to surround yourself with people that you trust, and that your friend, that you feel like you can talk to. That's obviously the first big one. The second, I would say, is that if you're going out, or if you're doing anything that you might cause your anxiety, then perhaps maybe have someone with you that could help calm you down, or help know that that you might have a bit of a panic whilst out there, or have, obviously, like Bri said, someone, I think when she was saying her family would go and order food for her or something like that. Because there are people out there who will do that sort of thing for you, but because, as I say, it's quite a big spectrum when it comes to anxiety, so I don't think there's any universal thing that's going to help everybody. But I would say that the best way is just accepting that you have anxiety is probably the first step of doing it, and then obviously looking to build off that and work out how can we make coping mechanisms that I can use in day-to-day life to help me when I get to a point where I might feel, a bit, having a bit of a panic. So that might be, I don't know, it might be a stress ball. It might be Chinese warrior balls. It might be having someone with you at all times that, or most of the time that can hopefully do whatever you're doing or speak on your behalf. Obviously, I know there are certain cases where you're not going to be with somebody. I think that was a good example when I was doing that interview where somebody came with anxiety on their own and they found it very hard to talk. And I think I could see that he actually learned some of his own ways of coping with anxiety. And I think the way I saw that he coped is I think he just took a deep breath. He sort of said, look, even if everybody else stops in the room, even if I slow everything down, I don't care. I'm talking right now, so I'm going to take my time and do it at my own pace. And I think, and everyone in the room was absolutely fine with that. And I think that was one of the great ways that person dealt with his anxiety and just, accepted it and just said, look, I'll take my time and I'll, do it at my pace. But obviously when it comes to your more extreme people that find it very hard to even go outside, I think that's obviously going to be something where you're probably going to maybe want to consult someone or have, yet again, another way of dealing with it. But that's probably what I would say on coping with anxiety.
Very interesting. Bri, do you have any coping mechanisms that you could share?
So I think there's kind of different coping mechanisms that you need for the different components of it. So I know obviously physical coping mechanisms for the fast heart rate, the panic attacks and things like that. I just find it's easier said than done, and it's something that you have to be able to sort of work with and develop the skill. But bringing yourself into a headspace where you can focus on one thing and you try to bring yourself to sort of out of, because you become almost in a tunnel when you physically go into a bit of a meltdown. I say meltdown, but into a sort of, a panic attack or however it manifests for you. You go into this little tunnel. You need something to be able to bring you out of that. And whether that's totally focusing your mind on a specific activity. So for me, sometimes it would be right, okay, I'm getting really worked up here now. I'm going to play Candy Crush on my phone because I need something to fully put my mind to, that I'll be not thinking about whatever's causing me this distress. But there's also, if you're not in a position where you can just get your phone out, there's also the hairband trick, which I thought worked quite well for myself, especially in terms of panic attacks. And it's just where you have a little hair bubble, so a hair tie, what you tie your hair up with, and you literally just slightly get it and ping it on your wrist, and that can help to bring you out of those real intense sort of mind frames that you go into, and especially with your physical coping mechanism. But it's a little bit controversial, because I guess by pinging something on your wrist, it is slightly bringing a slight pain to yourself. So as long as you're using it once or a couple of times when you need to use it, and you aren't sort of resorting to that as a continuous coping mechanism, it's not a long-term solution. It's something in the moment that you can use to get you out of that situation. But I've seen a lot of people try to do it, and then they just become sort of obsessed. Well, not obsessed as such, but sort of they just sit there and continually ping this hairband to sort of as a almost fidget thing to keep them from feeling anxious. And I guess if it works, maybe, but it's not. I would not recommend it in the long term. And then I'd say sort of mental side of things, just talking to somebody. So a lot of the time, the anxieties in your head can seem so much bigger and will have so much more power and control over you when they're in your brain, because you feel so isolated with that thought. And then when you voice it or even write it down or whatever, you realize that they're actually just words. And a lot of the time, there's not any sort of logical reasoning behind it. I know for me, there's not. So then also trying to talk about it. So not just saying it, but talking, okay, why have I got this in my head and where has it come from? Because it doesn't make any sense, or if it does make sense, then what can I do to help it? But that's making sure you've got somebody who you feel comfortable enough to do that, because I know with anxiety, even the thought of telling people your anxieties gives you more anxiety. So just making sure you've got sort of a safe person and a safe space to do that. If you haven't, maybe invest in a journal and do it just with yourself, but writing it down and that act of getting it out of your head can be really useful.
They all sound really, really effective, Brian. I particularly like writing things down in a journal or diary. Not only to remind you that anxiety is just all it's just all in your head. Anxiety is not reality, if that makes sense. But also, I think it could also be used as a reminder, like if you've been battling anxiety for a while and undergoing treatment, I think you can also use it to also see how far you've come. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think also talking to people about that same thing as well. So sometimes just at, I don't know, the dinner table or whatever, if I'm sat with my parents, they'll talk about how, oh, do you remember when you couldn't even order your own food, and like look at you now, going to university, doing presentations at work, like all this, you're flourishing. And it's just so nice to reflect on how far you've come, because it is really, really difficult, and anxiety can definitely consume your entire life. So if you're able to make any progress, you should really celebrate that. So if you do that in the form of talking to somebody or journaling, like I definitely think it's a good tip.
Excellent. Now, last but certainly not least, Jack. Your coping mechanisms, are they similar to Bry's there, or do you have something that is just as good, or something completely different? Talk us through it.
There's definitely a lot of coping mechanisms that I have that Brian mentioned, like with the journaling. Like I've actually been doing that recently. Like it wasn't something that I used to be big on a few years ago, but I picked it up recently because my anxiety has been quite high during this pandemic. So I picked it up recently, this journaling, and it actually is really kind of like helpful. And I think the whole logic behind it is it kind of like helps to kind of like restructure your thoughts, because anxiety, at least on a conscious level, it's all about what ifs and self-doubts and just doubts in general about all kinds of situations depending on your anxiety. But with journaling, it's like you can write down, I mean, for me, I've been writing down what I'm proud of, like what I've achieved, good things about myself. But like I've started off writing out how I felt so I could like transform that. Like even if it was negative how I felt, I'd write things I achieved afterwards, things I was proud of, and then good qualities about myself. And it kind of like transformed it around. And I think it does build up eventually. And with anxiety, it's important to catch it early on. Like if you can notice, if you have anxiety and you notice it getting worse again and you feel like you're relapsing, it's important to know that early on, to identify it and to know that you need help. And journaling is a good way to kind of like kickstart that off. But again, like if it does get serious, or it has got serious for me, definitely seek some kind of professional help for it as well. If you haven't had any already, like some kind of therapy, because it does go a long way, and it could help you further with cognitively restructuring like how your anxiety works. But yeah, also things on the moment that I do. I try to be mindful. Like I practice mindfulness. Something that I do is called grounding, and you can do this with anything. Like it's a bit similar to the hair bubble thing, but it's just typically with food, and like I usually do it with a raisin. So like I kind of like hold a raisin and I'll think, oh, how does it feel? Like what does it look like? What are the colours? How does it taste? And I always think of all these different qualities about the raisin. And it sounds very strange, but actually it helps to distract you and take your mind away from you, what usually is the future. Because anxiety, for me at least, tends to be being anxious about the future. And for me, if I could sum it up, it would be what if, in any phrase, because it's just a flurry of what ifs. And I think that stems like from social interaction in school, as we mentioned before, for me, because although it wasn't strictly education, for me, it was in terms of my peers. and I always felt like I wasn't I didn't fit in. And like Archie mentioned before, and it was just this kind of like, what if what if people don't like me, and what if people think I'm weird, like what if I make a scene kind of thing. And it's just that's what manifested really. And for my coping mechanisms, another thing I do is I try to reassure myself. And again, like similar with the journaling, I say, oh, like I'm wonderful, like people clearly think I'm funny and confident now, ironically. Like again, like I think that you can tell yourself that you're confident, and eventually it will become reality if you keep telling yourself that. Like it does pay off. So yeah, there are a few things. Those are a few things that I do for anxiety. Very similar as to what has already been mentioned, but definitely goes a long way.
No, it's really, really well detailed. Also, I like the term cognitive restructuring. I think that's going to be my new favorite term in 2021. But no, that's very valid. I think having professional help and self-care and your own coping mechanisms, I think having both of those side by side is ultimately the best way to tackle severe anxiety in the long run. So thank you. All those were fantastic coping mechanisms that you've shared. We're now going to close out this episode. But before we do that, I just want to go around everyone and ask for their final thoughts and advice. So, Bri, any final words before we close out this episode?
I think it's probably something that people hear a lot of the time, but just remembering that you're not alone in this. Anxiety can make you feel very, very isolated because you begin to think that everyone and anyone is against you. But I promise you that is probably not the case, and that there are many other people feeling the exact same way. And at some point in your life, you will find those people, those rare few gems who will look out for you and will make you feel a lot more optimistic. So even if it's rubbish right now, just please keep going and trying to seek some professional help or put some coping mechanisms in place, and you'll get there.
No, that's absolutely valid. Archie, what are your final thoughts?
I think, with everything going on right now with coronavirus and the pandemics and obviously the lockdowns, I think obviously there's definitely going to be a lot of people who will be dealing with their anxiety right now. And I think the only way the best advice that I can probably give is that I know it may seem like, it might seem like quite a big deal right now. And that's literally how I felt when I was in school. Like everything then felt like it was going to affect me for the rest of my life. It was going to really, really kind of, I feel like, oh God, everything in the moment there feel awful. And I think we're in one of those situations right now with the lockdowns and the coronavirus that everything feels right now like in the worst it's ever been, and that your anxiety must be going through the roof when it comes to this. But I think when this is all over, you'll look back and think about how in a sense I'm trying to think of the best way to put it, probably how little and inconceivable how little this was, I guess I could say, of an event, in a sense of that you were worrying, that people might have been worrying over with that anxiety, and that you'll look back and think, this is, God, I can't believe I worried about that. I've got much more things that I feel, that I have my anxiety about now, and in that sense. But it's probably not the best advice or anything like that. But I think maybe somebody out there got the point I was trying to make.
No, I'm sure someone did, Archie. That was that it's always great to have your input. Jack, what are your words of wisdom when it comes to anxiety?
Well, I just thought actually of what my therapist once said to me when I was having therapy for my anxiety, and she told me that experiencing anxiety is like looking at the world through dark sunglasses, and it's like you can't see all the colours, and it's like you're focused on all the negatives and everything that's going wrong. So with that in mind, I think it's important to notice things that go well in your life on a daily basis, no matter how small, and to celebrate them. So even if it's just something like you remembered to eat some meals that day, or you've managed to like change your bed sheets, or you've gone outside for a walk. These are things that should be celebrated because they are achievements, they are accomplishments in your life. And I also have one more last bit of kind of like wisdom, which is to kind of definitely be mindful of your loved ones around you and your support network. Because for me, I've found with my anxiety that the biggest factor in recovery for me is my kind of like support network that's been around me, like my best friends, my loved ones, like my dogs, literally everything like that. It's helped me bounce back from it all the more because I felt loved and validated and not alone. And I think that is the biggest factor in kind of like combating that feeling of endless isolation, as it seems at the time. Just kind of like telling someone you love about how you feel, even if it's a dog, like just tell them how you feel, and it can help letting it out that way.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head there, Jack. Definitely talk to people about it. You know, don't sit there in silence, because ultimately, if you do that, it'll just get worse and worse. And also, I just would like to say it's very, if you reach out for support, you know, don't have to feel ashamed about it. It's incredibly brave to open up to someone. It could be, I say, it could be a friend, or it could be a charity like the Samaritans, for example, who've helped myself and many other people with anxiety in the past. But yeah, opening up and also having a support network is really, really effective. That concludes our episode on anxiety. I just want to remind you all that we are on Twitter. You can follow us at CYPIEPTMidYAs, and if you're on Instagram, you can also follow us on there at MidlandsYA. Thank you, Bri, Jack, and Archie, for joining me this episode. We've had some really useful and powerful and also inspirational insights into today's topic concerning anxiety disorders. And I want to thank you, dear listener, for tuning in to the LGM podcast once again. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks, guys. Catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye.